She publicly humiliated him, calling him a liar from the slums. But what she didn't know is that a hidden camera had just recorded her confession to a murder, and her plan to kill again. Welcome to Blissful Whispers. We have an incredible community watching from every corner of the globe. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now down in the comments. The rain didn't just fall, it attacked. Each drop was a cold, silver needle, stitching the gray sky to the glistening blacktop of the city. For 14-year-old Malik Jones, it was just another obstacle. He pushed the glass door of the Speedy Mart open, the cheerful jingle of the bell a stark contrast to the grim reality of the downpour and the even grimmer total on his last pay stub. The thin fabric of his jacket was already surrendering, clinging to his skin like a second, colder layer. Exhaustion was a familiar ache in his bones, a constant companion after a 6-hour shift of stocking shelves and mopping floors, but resolution burned brighter in his eyes. He clutched the small, crinkled paper bag in his pocket. Inside was his grandmother Clara's heart medication. The cost of those tiny pills dictated his entire life. Every extra shift taken, every meal skipped, every dream deferred. He could almost hear her voice, warm and steady as a summer breeze, from a memory years ago. He brought home a stray dog, his face streaked with dirt, and she had simply smiled, cleaning them both up. "Don't you ever forget, baby," she'd said, tapping his chest right over his heart. "We may not have much in our pockets, but we're rich in here. And hearts are for helping." That principle was the only real inheritance he had, and he guarded it fiercely. The bus was still 20 minutes out, a lifetime in this weather. A shortcut was his only option. It meant cutting through Sterling Park, a place that felt like another country. Manicured lawns, ornate iron benches, and paths so smooth they seemed designed to mock the cracked, uneven sidewalks of his own neighborhood. It was a world of effortless beauty, a world not meant for him, but tonight, it was just a way to get home faster. As he jogged along the winding path, the perfectly sculpted landscape began to bleed into a muddy mess. That's when he saw her. A small figure stranded. 10-year-old Penelope Penny Sterling was a portrait of silent desperation. Her wheelchair, a sleek, futuristic machine that probably cost more than Malik's entire apartment, was hopelessly caught. Its wheels were being swallowed by a hungry, thick mud that had turned a section of the pristine lawn into a trap. 50 feet away, under the relative safety of an oak tree, her caregiver stood with her back turned, a bright phone screen illuminating her face, her voice a low murmur as she laughed at something someone on the other end said. She was in her own world, completely oblivious. Penny wasn't shouting, she seemed past that. Her small hands were raw from trying to push the wheels, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Silent tears traced clean paths down her mud-splattered cheeks, each one a tiny surrender to the cold and the crushing weight of being utterly alone. A couple in expensive running gear jogged past, their eyes flicking towards Penny for a split second before snapping forward, their pace quickening as if her problem might be contagious. They saw and they chose not to see. For them, she was an inconvenience, a landscape feature to be navigated around. But Malik saw something else. He saw a scared kid. He saw the tremble in her lip, the terror in her wide, pleading eyes. He didn't see her expensive chair or her designer clothes. He only heard his grandmother's voice, "Hearts are for helping." He didn't hesitate. The thought of his only good pair of sneakers, the ones he'd saved for months to buy, barely registered as he left the path and plunged into the thick, cloying mud. It sucked at his ankles, trying to pull him down, but his focus was singular. "Hey!" he called out, his voice cutting through the drumming rain. "I got you. Hold on." Penny's head snapped up, her eyes widening with a mixture of shock and a fragile flicker of hope. He reached the chair, the mud now up to his shins. "Let's get you out of here," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He gripped the handles, but the chair was an anchor. It wouldn't budge. The mud had claimed it. He could see her shivering now, her lips tinged with blue. There was no more time. Making a split-second decision, he leaned in. "Okay, new plan," he said softly, making sure to look her in the eye. "I'm going to lift you out. Put your arms around my neck. I won't drop you." For a moment she hesitated. Then, seeing nothing but determination in his face, she wrapped her small, trembling arms around his neck. He scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. She was lighter than he expected and so incredibly cold. Without a second thought, he shrugged out of his soaked jacket and wrapped it around her fragile frame. He turned his back to the wind, using his own body as a shield as he carried her through the mud and the rain, each step a testament to a promise his grandmother had taught him long ago. The sleek, black sedan appeared as if summoned from the storm itself, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt as it screeched to a halt. The door flew open before the engine was even off, and a man emerged, his tailored suit instantly darkened by the relentless rain. Donovan Sterling was the kind of man whose face was usually seen on the glossy pages of business magazines, composed, powerful, untouchable. But the man running towards them now was none of those things. He was simply a father, his face a canvas of raw, unfiltered panic. "Penny?" His voice was a ragged cry. He stumbled to a halt before the bench, his eyes devouring his daughter, checking for any sign of injury. Only when he was satisfied that she was physically unharmed did his gaze shift to the boy beside her. He took in the scene. His daughter, shivering but safe, wrapped in a jacket far too big for her, and the muddy, soaked teenager who held it in place, shielding her with his own body. He then looked over at the caregiver, who was now hurrying towards them, her phone hastily shoved away. Donovan's expression, which had been fraught with fear, hardened into something as cold and sharp as ice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You're fired," he said, the two words delivered with the finality of a guillotine. He then turned his full, undivided attention back to Malik. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went beyond mere gratitude. "Let me take you home. Please." The car was another world. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, the roar of the storm was reduced to a distant, muted hum. The air inside smelled of rich leather and something clean and faintly citrusy. For Malik, whose life was a symphony of city noises, sirens, shouting, the rumble of the bus, the profound silence was the most alien thing of all. As the heated seats began to chase the deep chill from his bones, Penny, now wrapped in a cashmere blanket that had appeared from a hidden compartment, reached out and slipped her small hand into his. It was a simple, trusting gesture that spoke volumes. "Where do you live, son?" Donovan asked, his eyes meeting Malik's in the rearview mirror. His voice was quiet, respectful. Malik gave him the address, feeling a familiar pang of shame for the worn-down building and the rough neighborhood. Donovan simply nodded, his expression unreadable as he typed it into the car's navigation system. The drive was filled with gentle questions. What school did he go to? What grade was he in? What did he like to study? Malik answered them all, acutely aware of the chasm between his world of underfunded public schools and crowded classrooms, and the world this family inhabited. When Donovan asked about his parents, Malik explained quietly about his grandmother, Clara, and her failing health. He didn't mean to let it slip, but the exhaustion and the warmth of the car loosened his tongue. He saw Donovan's eyes soften with a new understanding. The Sterling residence wasn't a house, it was an estate. A long, winding driveway led to a sprawling stone mansion that looked more like a museum than a home. As they stepped into the cavernous entryway, a woman in a crisp uniform appeared silently to take their wet things. Malik stood dripping on a marble floor that gleamed like a frozen lake, feeling impossibly small and out of place. The walls soared 2 stories high, adorned with paintings that looked like they belonged behind velvet ropes. The silence here was different from the car. It was a heavy, echoing quiet, the kind that swallows sound whole. Donovan led them into a study lined with floor-to-ceiling books. A fire crackled in a grand fireplace. "Please," Donovan said, gesturing to a leather chair that probably cost more than Malik's rent for a year. "Malik, what you did today, you didn't just help my daughter. You showed a kind of character, a kind of integrity, that is the most valuable asset in the world. I saw 3 other people walk past her." He paused, his gaze intense. "I overheard what you said about your grandmother. You're carrying a heavy burden for a 14-year-old boy. A burden you shouldn't have to carry alone." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on his mahogany desk. "This isn't charity, Malik. Consider it an investment. An investment in the kind of person the world needs more of. I want to cover all of your grandmother's medical expenses. The best doctors, the best care. Whatever she needs." Malik's breath hitched. His mind reeled. "And that's not all," Donovan continued. "A boy with your character deserves the best opportunities. There's a place for you at Northwood Preparatory Academy. Full scholarship. It's yours if you want it." The words hung in the air, immense and terrifying. A hot flush of pride surged through Malik. "We don't take handouts. It was a mantra Clara had drilled into him his entire life. He could feel the weight of his grandmother's fierce independence, of their struggle, of their dignity. His mouth opened to refuse to say, "Thank you, but we'll be okay." But then another image flooded his mind. The sight of Clara struggling for breath after climbing the 5 flights of stairs to their apartment. The stack of red-stamped final notice bills on their small kitchen table. The quiet fear in her eyes that she tried so hard to hide from him. His pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. His desperation was a crushing, undeniable force. He looked from Donovan's sincere, expectant face to Penny, who was watching him from the doorway. Her expression wasn't one of pity. It was one of pure, unadulterated hope. She wasn't seeing a charity case, she was seeing a friend. A hero. The war inside him lasted only a moment longer. He swallowed, the word catching in his throat. "Okay," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the crackling fire. It was the smallest word he had ever spoken, but it carried the weight of a collapsing world and the hope of a new one being born. The ground beneath his feet no longer felt solid. He was in another world now, and he had no idea what the rules were. Northwood Preparatory Academy was less like a school and more like the campus of a small Ivy League university. Ancient brick buildings were draped in ivy, and students in crisp, navy blazers moved across perfectly manicured quads with an air of casual, inherited confidence. For Malik, whose previous school was a concrete block where survival often trumped scholarship, the culture shock was a physical force. Every hallway felt like a silent judgment, every curious glance a confirmation that he was an imposter, a charity case wearing a costume. For the first week he felt like he was holding his breath, waiting for the illusion to shatter. What anchored him, what made it all bearable, was Penny. She became his guide, his translator for this strange new world. In the sprawling, sun-drenched library she would patiently break down complex calculus problems for him, her explanations clear and brilliant. She taught him the unwritten rules, which teachers favored debate, which lunch tables were for which social circles, and how to navigate the labyrinthine school traditions. In return, Malik offered her something she'd never had, a shield. He was the first person to see past the sterling name and the wheelchair to the 10-year-old girl who was often lonely in a crowd. He noticed it during a group project in history class. 3 other students, all from legacy families, talked over Penny, dismissing her ideas with polite, almost imperceptible smiles. They would listen to her speak, then turn to each other and continue their own conversation as if she were a ghost at the table. Malik saw the familiar flicker of resignation in Penny's eyes, the slight slump of her shoulders. He felt a hot, protective anger rise in his chest. He didn't cause a scene. He just waited for the next time one of the boys cut her off. Then he leaned forward, his voice low but impossible to ignore. "Hold on," he said, looking directly at the boy. Penny was talking. "I want to hear the rest of her idea." The table went silent. The other students, surprised by his directness, looked from him to Penny. She straightened up, a small, grateful smile touching her lips, and finished her point. From that day on, no one at that table ignored her again. He became her brother in the hallways of Northwood, and she became his champion in the classroom. For the first time in their respective lives, adrift in their own lonely oceans, they had found a harbor in each other. Their newfound peace, however, was a fragile thing, and its greatest threat came from within the walls of the Sterling mansion itself. Genevieve Archer, Donovan's fiancée, was a master of the flawless performance. In Donovan's presence, she was the picture of maternal warmth. She would ruffle Malik's hair, calling him Penny's guardian angel, and praise his improving grades with a dazzling smile. She championed his presence, telling Donovan's friends the story of the rescue in the park with a tear in her eye, painting herself as the benevolent future stepmother who adored the heroic boy. But when Donovan was gone, the temperature in the room would drop. Her kindness would curdle into something cloying and condescending. The change was never overt, never anything Malik could point to and call cruel. It was in the subtle, poisonous details. One afternoon, as he was leaving for school, she stopped him in the grand foyer. My, she said, circling him slowly. "That uniform fits you perfectly. It's amazing what a good tailor can do, isn't it? You look almost like you belong here." The words were a compliment, but the tone was an insult, a stark reminder of his otherness. She would touch his arm, but only with the tips of her manicured fingers, as if he were a dusty object she was hesitant to handle. Her favorite phrase, always delivered with a syrupy smile, was, "You are just so lucky." She said it when he got a good grade, when Donovan bought him new books, when Penny laughed at one of his jokes. She framed his entire existence in her home not as a result of his character, but as a winning lottery ticket, a stroke of dumb luck that could be revoked at any moment. Her smile was a perfect, practiced curve of the lips, but it never ever reached her eyes. Her eyes were cold, assessing, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a predator watching its prey. One evening before a charity gala, she found him in the library. She glided over to him, the enormous diamond on her finger catching the light and throwing sharp, glittering shards across the room. She placed a hand on his shoulder, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. "It's just wonderful that Donovan is giving you this chance," she said, her voice a sweet, conspiratorial whisper. "We're all so proud of how well you're adjusting." But her eyes told a different story. They swept over him, and for a fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated contempt. If you believe true kindness comes from the heart and not just for show, hit that subscribe button. Only phonies like Genevieve would scroll past. The fire in Donovan Sterling's study cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, but the warmth of the room did little to soften the chill that was about to descend. He had asked to speak with Genevieve privately, and she had entered with the easy grace of a woman who believed she was the queen of the castle. She sat across from him on the plush leather sofa, her expression a perfect blend of loving curiosity. "Darling," Donovan began, his voice calm and affectionate. "As we get closer to the wedding, my attorneys insist we handle some practical matters. It's just business, a formality for someone in my position. It's a prenuptial agreement." Genevieve's smile didn't falter. She reached across the coffee table and placed her hand on his. "Of course, Donovan. I understand completely. Your legacy, Penny's legacy, is the most important thing. I would never want you to think I'm interested in anything but you and our family." Her performance was flawless, her sincerity seemingly absolute. "I knew you'd understand," he said, relieved. "The agreement is incredibly generous, Genevieve. It ensures you'll be comfortable for the rest of your life, no matter what happens." He then took a slight breath, the next part being the most crucial. "It also works in conjunction with my will, which, as you know, is ironclad. The entirety of Sterling Corporation and the estate are held in a trust. Penny is the sole beneficiary. It's what her mother would have wanted." And there it was. The trigger. For a fraction of a second, the mask shattered. It wasn't a dramatic, overt change. It was a terrifyingly subtle shift. The warmth in Genevieve's eyes instantly evaporated, replaced by a flat, cold fury that was as shocking as a plunge into icy water. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened ever so slightly on his hand, her nails pressing into his skin. Her jawline hardened and a muscle ticked just below her ear. It lasted no longer than a single, skipped heartbeat. Then the mask was back in place. The adoring smile returned, the loving gaze re-emerged, but the room was forever colder for that one moment of truth. Inside her mind, a carefully constructed 5-year plan was crumbling to dust. The years of feigned sympathy after his wife's death, the calculated comfort offered to a lonely little girl, the patient seduction of a grieving billionaire, all of it. She had invested years of her life in this long con, positioning herself to inherit an empire. And now she was being offered a severance package. A generous one to be sure, but it was nothing. Crumbs from a banquet she had intended to host. The fury raging within her was a white-hot inferno. The game had changed. If she couldn't inherit the fortune, she would have to take it. And the one obstacle, the one small wheelchair-bound obstacle, had to be removed. Later that week, her desperation found its opportunity. She found Malik in the cavernous garage, a space that smelled of ozone, wax, and old money. He was waiting for Donovan to take him and Penny to a robotics club meeting, idly admiring a vintage sports car under a dust cover. The echo of his footsteps on the polished concrete floor made him seem small and alone. Genevieve glided in, her heels clicking softly. "Malik, there you are," she said, her voice a melody of sweet concern. "Just the person I was hoping to see. You're so good with your hands, I've noticed." He looked up, surprised. "I am?" "Of course," she said with a dazzling smile. "I was just looking at Penny's van. The mechanic is coming tomorrow to replace the entire lift motor. It's been acting up. He mentioned last time that these old housing screws," She walked over and pointed to a series of thick, heavy-duty bolts at the core of the lift's hydraulic mechanism, are always a nightmare for him to get out. They seize up. She picked up a heavy wrench from a nearby tool chest and offered it to him. Could you be a dear and do me a huge favor? Just give each of them a few turns to loosen them up. Not all the way, of course. Just enough to break the seal. It would save the poor man an hour of work tomorrow. Malik took the wrench, its weight unfamiliar and heavy in his hand. He looked at the thick, formidable bolts she was pointing to. They didn't look old, they looked essential. They looked like the very things that kept the heavy platform from crashing to the ground. A cold, prickling unease crawled up his spine. Something about this felt profoundly wrong. I don't know, Genevieve, he said slowly. I'm not a mechanic. I don't want to break anything. Her smile tightened just a fraction. Oh, don't be silly. You can't possibly break it. You're just helping. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but firm, a subtle assertion of her authority. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Besides, it's the least you can do to be helpful, right? To show Donovan how grateful you are for this opportunity. The words were a veiled threat, a silken reminder of his status as a guest, a charity case. His place here, she was implying, was conditional. He looked from her perfectly composed, smiling face to the cold, hard steel of the wrench, and then to the bolts that held Penny's life in the balance. Every instinct in his body screamed danger. Malik's hand hovers over the wrench, a cold dread washing over him. Genevieve's voice is like honey, but her request feels like a death sentence. There's nothing worse than someone trying to manipulate you for their own gain. Comment, I see you, down below if you can't stand users and manipulators like Genevieve. Malik stood frozen in the echoing silence of the garage, the cold, heavy steel of the wrench resting in his palm. Genevieve's words slithered in his mind, coiling around his sense of duty and gratitude. It's the least you can do, to show how grateful you are. Was this what gratitude was? A blind, unquestioning obedience? He looked at the thick, unforgiving bolts. He pictured the metal lift, the complex hydraulics, and Penny's trusting face as she was raised into the van. He imagined the sickening screech of metal, the sudden, terrifying drop. The image was so vivid, so horrifying, that it sent a jolt of ice through his veins. His grandmother's voice cut through the fog of fear and confusion, clearer than ever. Hearts are for helping. And this wasn't helping. This was hurting. This was danger. He realized in that instant that true help wasn't about pleasing the powerful. It was about protecting the vulnerable. His loyalty wasn't to Genevieve, who saw him as a pawn. It was to Penny, who saw him as a friend. His decision was made. With a deliberate, steady hand, he placed the wrench back on the red metal tool chest. The click of steel on steel was a small, sharp sound, but to him, it felt like a gunshot, a declaration of defiance. He turned his back on the van, on the unspoken threat in Genevieve's smile, and walked out of the garage. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear of what he was leaving behind, but of what he knew he had to do next. He found Donovan in his study, the same room where his life had been irrevocably changed. The comforting fire now seemed to cast menacing shadows on the walls. Malik stood in the doorway, his hands trembling, his throat dry. Malik? What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost, Donovan said, his brow furrowing with concern. Malik took a deep, shuddering breath. The words came out in a rush, a torrent of fear and certainty. It's Genevieve, he began, his voice barely a whisper. We were in the garage. She asked me to do something to Penny's van. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet Donovan's gaze. She told me to loosen the screws on the wheelchair lift. Donovan stared at him, his expression shifting from concern to utter disbelief. For a moment he said nothing, the accusation hanging in the air between them, too monstrous to comprehend. Malik, he said slowly, his voice laced with skepticism, that's a very serious thing to say. There must be some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Malik insisted, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. She gave me a wrench. She pointed to the exact bolts. She said it was to help the mechanic. Donovan's face was a mask of conflict. The love he felt for Genevieve warred with the deep, instinctual trust he had placed in this boy. He wanted to dismiss it, to believe there was a rational explanation, but the raw terror in Malik's eyes was undeniable. Stay here, he said, his voice grim. He pressed a button on his intercom. Genevieve, could you join me in the study, please? She entered moments later, a portrait of effortless elegance. Darling, is everything all right? She asked, her eyes flicking from Donovan's stern face to Malik's pale one. A flicker of something cold and calculating passed through her gaze before she masked it with a concerned smile. Donovan didn't waste time. Genevieve, Malik has just told me something very disturbing. He says you asked him to loosen the screws on Penny's wheelchair lift. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. Genevieve didn't deny it. She didn't offer an explanation. She erupted. A gasp of pure, theatrical horror escaped her lips, her hand flying to her chest as if she'd been shot. Tears, shockingly real, welled in her eyes. What? She cried, her voice breaking with manufactured pain. She turned on Malik, and the loving fiancé vanished, replaced by a spitting viper. How dare you? She shrieked, her voice echoing in the grand study. How dare you stand there and tell such a disgusting, twisted lie? She advanced on him, her elegant facade crumbling to reveal something ugly and vicious beneath. After everything we have done for you, we took you in. We gave you clothes and education, a life you could only dream of. She spun back to Donovan, her tears now flowing freely. Do you see, Donovan? Do you see what happens? You bring this boy from the slums, someone like him, into our home, and this is the thanks you get. He's trying to extort us. It's obvious. He wants money, and he's willing to invent this monstrous story to get it. Her attack was a torrent of prejudice, each word a carefully chosen weapon designed to wound and discredit. What's next? Will he claim I pushed him? That you mistreated him? There's no limit to what people like that will do for a payday. She was painting him as a predator, a creature from another world who had invaded their sanctuary. The room was thick with her poison, with years of barely concealed contempt now boiling over. Donovan stood frozen, caught in the crossfire. He looked at Genevieve, the woman he loved, her face a mask of what looked like genuine, heartbroken outrage. Then he looked at Malik, a 14-year-old boy, trembling but standing his ground, his eyes wide with the shock of her viciousness. One of them was a victim. The other was a monster. And in that terrible, suspended moment, he had no idea which was which. Genevieve points a finger at Malik, her face twisted with fake outrage, trying to use his background against him. If you believe character matters more than zip code and that prejudice is a tool for the weak, hit that like button. Only bullies and bigots would refuse. The silence in Donovan Sterling's study was a physical entity, thick and suffocating. It was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of Genevieve's carefully practiced, heartbroken sobs. She stood as the perfect image of a wronged woman, her face a mask of wounded betrayal. She had played her hand masterfully, banking on the unshakable foundation of her relationship with Donovan, confident that he would choose his devoted fiancé over the troubled, out-of-place boy he barely knew. She believed she had won. Malik stood his ground, his terror a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He was a 14-year-old boy in a room that felt like a courtroom, facing a prosecutor with claws. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to apologize, to make it all go away. But he didn't. He thought of Penny, of the cold dread he'd felt holding that wrench. He met Genevieve's tearful, accusing gaze and held it, his own expression a silent testament to the truth. His strength wasn't in words, it was in his refusal to break. Donovan was trapped between them, a man being torn in two. His heart, the part of him that had allowed itself to love again after years of grief, desperately wanted to believe Genevieve. He wanted to wrap her in his arms and dismiss this as a bizarre, terrible misunderstanding. But his mind, the sharp, analytical mind that had built an empire, was screaming a warning. He looked at Genevieve's elaborate, theatrical despair, a performance worthy of an Oscar. Then he looked at Malik's raw, unpolished terror. It was the simple, unadorned fear of a child telling the truth to an adult who might not believe him. And it was devastatingly convincing. He was at an impasse, a crossroads with no clear path. Then a memory surfaced. A conversation from months ago with his head of security about upgrading the estate's surveillance system. High definition, motion activated, cloud storage. Every angle covered. His gaze drifted towards the corner of the room, as if he could see through the walls to the garage. His voice cut through Genevieve's sobs, quiet but absolute. There's a ring camera on the garage. Let's just see. The change in Genevieve was instantaneous. The flow of tears stopped as if a faucet had been shut off. The color drained from her face, leaving her flawless makeup looking like a garish mask on pale skin. A flicker of pure, animal panic flashed in her eyes before she could conceal it. "Donovan, don't be ridiculous," she began, her voice suddenly strained, losing its melodramatic tremor. "You're not seriously going to dignify this fantasy by—" "I am," Donovan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He was already moving to the large monitor mounted on the wall, his fingers flying across a keyboard. Her panic was more damning than any confession. The screen flickered to life, showing a pristine, wide-angle view of the garage. The three of them stood reflected in the monitor's dark screen, ghosts watching a memory that was only minutes old. Donovan found the timestamp and hit play. The scene unfolded in silence at first. There was Malik looking small amidst the luxury cars. There was Genevieve, gliding towards him with that brilliant, predatory smile. They saw her point to the van. They saw her hand him the wrench. The visuals alone were incriminating, a perfect match to Malik's story. "Audio," Donovan commanded the system. Genevieve's voice, honeyed and smooth, filled the study, a chilling counterpoint to the tense, silent woman standing beside them. "Could you be a dear and do me a huge favor? Just give each of them a few turns to loosen them up." The recording captured every word, every manipulative inflection. They heard Malik's hesitant refusal. And then they heard Genevieve's final, poisonous barb. "It's the least you can do to be helpful, right? To show Donovan how grateful you are." The evidence was absolute, irrefutable. Malik's story wasn't a lie, it was a word-for-word transcript. He had been telling the truth. Genevieve made a choked, strangled sound. The performance was over, the mask shattered beyond repair. She stared at her own smiling, lying face on the screen, her expression a mixture of horror and disbelief, as if she couldn't believe her own perfect plan had unraveled so completely. "I can explain," she stammered, but the words were hollow, meaningless. She was exposed, trapped by her own digital ghost. A wave of relief so profound it almost made Malik dizzy washed over him. But it was a cold comfort, tinged with the horror of what she had almost made him do. Donovan's face was a thundercloud of fury and disgust. He reached for the keyboard to stop the video, to end this nightmare. "Wait," Malik said, his voice quiet but urgent. "Let it play." Puzzled, Donovan paused. On the screen, Malik's recorded self placed the wrench down and walked out of the frame, leaving Genevieve alone. For a few seconds she simply stood there, her back to the camera. The audience in the study held its breath, thinking the scene was over. Then she turned slightly, her profile becoming visible. She subtly touched a nearly invisible earpiece tucked into her ear, a piece of tech no one knew she had. Her face, no longer smiling, was a mask of cold, reptilian fury. She thought she was alone. She thought she was safe. Her voice, when it came, was no longer sweet. It was a low, venomous whisper, meant for one person on the other end of a hidden line, but captured forever by the unblinking eye of the camera. "He didn't do it." The boy talked. "We're moving to plan B. It has to look like an accident, just like the first one." The video feed clicked off, plunging the monitor into darkness. The silence that followed was heavier, more terrifying than anything that had come before. Donovan stood utterly still, his hand frozen over the keyboard. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, ashen gray. He looked like he had been turned to stone. He swayed slightly, his hand gripping the edge of the mahogany desk for support. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a dry, rasping whisper, a sound of a man whose world had just been obliterated. The first one? The question hung in the dead air, a horrifying new key to a lock no one had known existed, promising to unleash a darkness far deeper and more monstrous than anyone could have ever imagined. The footage cuts off, leaving Donovan and Malik in stunned silence. The evil is deeper than they ever imagined. What did she mean by the first one? If you're on the edge of your seat and need to see justice served, smash that subscribe button. Let's unmask this monster together. The silence that followed Donovan's whispered question was heavier than a tombstone. For a single paralyzing moment, he was adrift in a sea of pure horror, the ghost of his late wife Liana and the terrifying image of Penny in danger swirling in the abyss. The grief he had so carefully managed for 5 years threatened to drown him. But then something else took over. The shock receded, and in its place rose a cold, terrifying resolve. The heartbroken husband vanished, and the ruthless CEO who had built an empire on calculated precision took control. Genevieve, seeing the shift in his eyes from devastation to something harder and more dangerous, began to scramble. "Donovan, darling, that was nothing," she said, her voice a desperate, trembling attempt at normalcy. "It's a misunderstanding. The first 1 foot. I was talking about a business deal, a plan that failed, you know how I—" "Be quiet," Donovan commanded. The words were not shouted. They were spoken with a lethal quietness that instantly silenced her. He turned his back on her, his movements economical and precise. He pulled out his phone, his thumb swiping across the screen to a secure contact. The call was answered on the first ring. "Kincaid," Donovan said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I need you. Full team. Now." He paused, his eyes flicking to the dark screen where Genevieve's monstrous confession had played out. "I'm initiating a full-spectrum background investigation on Genevieve Archer. I want every text, every email, every financial transaction, every second of her life for the last 6 years put under a microscope. I want to know who she talks to, who she pays, who she's ever even looked at sideways. Spare no expense. And Kincaid, prioritize the period 3 months before and after my wife's death." He ended the call and finally turned to face Genevieve. She looked trapped, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. "You will go to your suite of rooms and you will wait there," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Your phones, your laptop, all of your devices will be brought to me. Your access to all accounts has been frozen. Guards will be posted outside your door to ensure your privacy." He let the word hang in the air, a silken threat. This wasn't an imprisonment, it was a quarantine. He was isolating a disease. While a shell-shocked but resolute Malik helped a trusted housekeeper get Penny to a separate wing of the mansion, far from the unfolding nightmare, Donovan's war room was already taking shape. Kincaid, a seasoned private investigator with eyes that had seen the worst of human nature, arrived within the hour. His team of digital forensic experts and researchers descended on the Sterling estate, their work beginning immediately. The first 24 hours were a digital excavation. They peeled back the layers of Genevieve's carefully constructed life, and what they found beneath was a masterpiece of deceit. There were hidden bank accounts showing large, unexplained cash withdrawals at strategic times. There were encrypted messaging apps and a network of contacts that had been systematically scrubbed. They found a pattern. Before every major step up in her relationship with Donovan, there was a flurry of covert activity, a web of secrets and lies. Kincaid's focus remained lasered in on the death of Liana Sterling. The official report had called it a tragic accident, brake failure on a rain-slicked road. But as they dug, anomalies appeared. The mechanic who had serviced the car a week before the crash had quit his job and moved out of state 2 days after, paid in cash. The traffic camera on that stretch of road had mysteriously malfunctioned that exact morning. Each detail was a single, innocuous thread, but Kincaid was beginning to see how they wove together into a dark and terrifying tapestry. The breakthrough came from an old human resources file. "We've got a ghost," Kincaid told Donovan on the second day, pointing to a name on a tablet. Amelia Vance. She was Genevieve's executive assistant back when Genevieve was still your PA. She was fired 4 months before Liana's death. "What was the reason?" Donovan asked. "A minor clerical error, according to the file. Something that would normally warrant a warning at most," Kincaid explained. "But Genevieve didn't just fire her. She had her blacklisted. Ruined her career. The punishment was wildly disproportionate to the crime. That tells me Vance knew something. Genevieve wasn't just firing an employee, she was silencing a witness." It took Kincaid's team another day to find her. Amelia Vance was living in a small, rundown apartment 2 states away, working a dead-end job under a different name. When Kincaid knocked on her door, the woman who answered was a shadow of the confident young professional in her file photo. Her eyes were filled with a haunted, persistent fear. She denied everything at first, her hands trembling. "I don't know anything," she repeated, trying to shut the door. "Please just leave me alone. You don't know what she's capable of." Kincaid held the door with his foot, his expression softening. He didn't use threats. He didn't offer money. He appealed to the one thing her fear hadn't yet extinguished, her conscience. "I understand you're scared, Miss Vance," he said quietly. "But this isn't about the past anymore. 2 days ago, Genevieve Archer tried to arrange an accident for Donovan Sterling's 10-year-old daughter. Amelia's face went white. The name Penny seemed to break through the wall of her terror. She failed because a good kid with a strong heart stood in her way, Kincaid continued, pressing the advantage. We believe she's done this before. We believe she's the reason Liana Sterling is dead. If you know something, if you can help us stop her from hurting anyone else, now is the time to speak. Amelia stared at him, her breathing shallow. The fear was still there, a cornered animal in her eyes. But now it was warring with a fresh, righteous horror. The thought of that monster getting her hands on a little girl, on Penny, it was a weight too heavy for her silence to bear. She slowly, shakily unlatched the chain on her door. Come in, she whispered. There's something you need to see. The study was no longer a place of comfort. It was a cage. The warm, crackling fire from days before was now a cold, dark hearth. Donovan Sterling stood behind his desk, not as a grieving man, but as an executioner, his face carved from granite. Standing with him was Kincaid, the investigator, and a pale, trembling woman who seemed to carry the weight of years of fear on her shoulders. Amelia Vance. Malik was there too, a silent observer near the doorway, his presence a constant, quiet reminder of how this all began. The heavy oak doors opened, and 2 guards escorted Genevieve inside. Her 3 days of confinement had stripped away her polished veneer. Her hair was slightly out of place, her eyes held a wild, cornered look, but she still clung to a last shred of defiant arrogance. She surveyed the room, her gaze landing on Amelia. A flash of pure venom crossed her face before she masked it with a scornful laugh. Really, Donovan? This is your grand investigation? She sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. You're dredging up a disgraced, incompetent assistant I fired years ago? This is what my life, our life together, has been reduced to. A baseless conspiracy theory from a hysterical child and a vindictive secretary? Kincaid stepped forward, his voice calm and professional, a stark contrast to her histrionics. Ms. Archer, we have a complete record of your financial activities, your communication logs, and your movements for the past 6 years. We found a great deal. But Ms. Vance was kind enough to fill in the most important blanks. Amelia, clutching a small external hard drive in her shaking hands, flinched under Genevieve's glare but held her ground. I knew you were doing something wrong, she said, her voice barely a whisper but clear in the suffocating silence. You were creating ghost accounts, deleting records. I made a full backup of your workstation drive the week before you fired me. I was scared. I never looked at it. Until now. She handed the drive to a tech expert who connected it to the large monitor on the wall. A moment later, a series of deleted files appeared, their contents now fully restored. It was an email chain sent from a ghost account under a fake name to a mechanic with a criminal record. The text on the screen was cold, transactional, the mundane business of arranging a murder. 2. Jack's Auto Repair from J. Smith. Subject. Inquiry message. Need a consultation. High-end German sedan. Brake system. Require a specific time-delayed point of failure. Discretion is paramount. Payment in cash. The chain continued, detailing a discussion of a specific winding road, an agreement on a sum of $50,000, and a final confirmation of payment, dated 2 days before Liana Sterling's death. Genevieve's face was a mask of disbelief. This is a joke, she scoffed, though a bead of sweat traced a path down her temple. Those are fake. Fabricated. Anyone can fake an email. This is pathetic, Donovan. Liana was my friend. I mourned her with you. Why would I ever do something so monstrous? This was the moment Donovan had been waiting for. He stepped out from behind his desk, his movements slow, deliberate, each step closing the distance between them like a predator stalking its prey. His voice, when he spoke, was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Because you weren't trying to kill Liana, he said. The statement hung in the air, confusing and terrible. Genevieve stared at him, her brow furrowed. What are you talking about? The road, Donovan continued, his voice dropping even lower. The steep hill mentioned in the emails. Your target location. I couldn't understand why. It wasn't on Liana's usual route to the city. She rarely drove that way. He took another step, his eyes boring into hers. But the investigators cross-referenced it with our family's schedule from that time. And they found something. That road, it was the only way down from Penny's preschool. The blood drained from Genevieve's face. She finally understood. The time of the planned failure was 3:30 p.m., Donovan said, his voice a low, guttural growl of a father's protective rage. Right after school let out. You were never trying to kill my wife. He was standing directly in front of her now, their faces inches apart. You were trying to kill our daughter. He let the horrifying truth sink in. Liana taking the car for an errand that morning wasn't the tragedy you planned for. It was a coincidence that saved Penny's life. It was this final, perfect unmasking of her deepest, darkest secret that finally shattered her. The realization that they knew everything, not just what she did but why, broke the last dam of her composure. Her face, stripped of all its masks, twisted into a grotesque sneer of pure, undiluted hatred. The careful, manipulative woman was gone, replaced by the monster that had been lurking beneath all along. Yes, she shrieked, the sound tearing through the silent study, raw and unhinged. Yes, I did it. Are you happy now? She laughed, a high, sharp sound devoid of all humor. That little girl. She was always the obstacle. The sainted memory of her perfect mother, the endless medical bills, the way you looked at her. She was a black hole for your money, your attention, your love. Your precious Penny was a millstone around my neck, and I was going to cut her loose. Her confession was a volcanic eruption of entitlement and rage. You all stand there judging me, she spat, her eyes wild, darting from Donovan to Amelia to Malik. But you have no idea what it's like to be so close to everything you've ever wanted, only to have it all promised to a broken little charity case. I earned this life. I worked for it. I comforted you. I raised your daughter when you were too lost in your grief to function. This fortune was my due, my payment for services rendered. And I would have done anything to get it. She finally turned her hateful glare on Malik. And you, she hissed. You worthless little stray. I would have gotten away with it all if it wasn't for you. Her final, hateful words echoed in the dead air, a raw and naked confession of her greed. The rot at her core was finally exposed for all to see, ugly and absolute. Genevieve's hateful words echo in the silent room, exposing the rot at her core. Her greed and cruelty are almost unbelievable. Comment justice for Penny below if you believe people like this deserve to face the consequences of their actions. In the aftermath of her venomous confession, the end came swiftly. Genevieve didn't scream or fight as the uniformed officers, summoned by Kincaid, entered the study. The fire in her had been extinguished, leaving behind only the cold, dead ash of her ambition. As she was led away in handcuffs, a single silent tear traced a path down her cheek, not a tear of remorse, but of the bitter final realization that she had lost. The monster had been caged. The story exploded across the media. Billionaire's fiancé arrested for murder, the headlines screamed. News vans camped outside the Sterling estate's formidable gates, their satellite dishes pointed at the house like accusations. But inside, a quiet, determined cleansing was underway. Donovan moved through his home with a grim purpose, issuing quiet orders. Every trace of Genevieve was to be purged. Her designer clothes were boxed up for donation. Her photographs were removed from their silver frames. Her expensive furniture was moved into storage. It was a systematic erasure, a purging of a poison that had nearly destroyed his family from the inside out. Within a day, it was as if she had never existed. A few evenings later, a fragile peace had settled over the mansion. The roaring fire in the study had been lit once more, but this time it offered a gentle, comforting warmth. Donovan found Malik and Penny in the family living room, sitting in comfortable silence, a half-finished chess game between them. The weight of the last few days was still visible in their eyes, but it was overshadowed by an unspoken, unbreakable bond. Donovan sat down, not in his usual imposing armchair, but on the ottoman close to them, bringing himself to their level. He looked at Malik, and the formidable seal was gone, leaving only a father, his heart full of a gratitude so immense it was difficult to put into words. Malik, he began, his voice thick with emotion. I've been trying to find a way to thank you, but the words don't exist. Nothing I could ever give you could possibly measure up to what you've done for us. He shook his head, his gaze unwavering. When you pulled Penny out of that mud, you saved her life. I knew that then. But I didn't know the half of it. He leaned forward, his expression etched with a painful sincerity. You didn't just save her from the mud, Malik. You saved her from a monster. You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. You saved this family. You saved us all. Tears welled in Malik's eyes. He had never been looked at with such profound respect. He was just a kid who had tried to do the right thing. This isn't about gratitude anymore, Donovan continued, his voice softening. And it's not about a scholarship or a debt being repaid. This is about family. Over the past few weeks, I've watched you with Penny. I've seen your courage, your integrity, your heart. In every way that matters, you are already my son. He took a deep breath, his next words changing everything forever. I want to make it official. I've spoken to Clara and she's given her blessing. Malik Jones, would you honor me? Would you let me adopt you and become my son? The question hung in the quiet room, beautiful and overwhelming. Malik was speechless, the tears he'd been holding back now streaming freely down his face. He looked over at Penny. She was beaming, her eyes shining brighter than he had ever seen them. She wheeled her chair closer and took his hand. Say yes, Malik, she whispered excitedly. I've always wanted a brother. Her simple, heartfelt plea was all he needed. He looked back at Donovan, at the man who was offering him not just a home, but a father. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Yes, he finally managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. Yes. 1 year later, the Sterling mansion was no longer a silent, cavernous museum. It was a home filled with the kind of joyful chaos that only a real family can create. In a sun-drenched workshop that smelled of solder and potential, Malik and Penny were deep in a familiar debate. The torque converter is misaligned, I'm telling you. Penny insisted, pointing to a schematic on her tablet. It's not the torque, it's the power distribution, Malik argued back, holding up a small, complex-looking circuit board. If we bypass this relay, we'll get a 30% efficiency boost. They bickered like they'd been doing it their entire lives, with the easy, affectionate rhythm of true siblings. Watching them from a comfortable armchair in the corner was Clara, her face glowing with a healthy, vibrant light that had been absent for years. The worry was gone, replaced by a look of profound, peaceful pride as she watched her grandson, now a confident young man, thrive. This was the happy ending she had prayed for but never dared to expect. They were not a family born of blood, but one forged in the crucible of courage, integrity, and the simple, powerful choice to help. Malik laughed, conceding the point to Penny. He knelt beside her chair, not the one that had been trapped in the mud, but a newer, better version. He carefully helped her attach the very circuit board they had been arguing about, a new long-range navigation sensor they had designed together. It was a device born from their shared experience, designed to ensure no one ever felt stranded again. Look at them now, a real family built on trust and love, not greed. If you believe that what we build is more important than what we own, hit that subscribe button one last time. Let's all choose to build something good today.